Good evening. Hello. Welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Matt Welton. I am the membership manager here at the Oriental Institute, and we're very pleased tonight to bring you this wonderful lecture. Thank you for coming out. And next year is going to be quite the year here at the Oriental Institute. It is our centennial, and we will have a number of enhanced programming, special members events. So if you are not a member, please do join us next year for a very exciting year. And now I'd like to welcome up the Chauncey S. Boucher Distinguished Service Professor of Assyriology, Martha Roth.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Okay, thank you. Yes, so I am Martha Roth, and Chris Woods is off in the Middle East now, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker for us, Professor Karen Radner. Thank you. Okay. Radner holds the Alexander von Humboldt Professorship of Ancient History of the Near and Middle East at Ludwig Maximilians University, Munich, where she has been on the faculty now since 2015. She is also honorary professor of ancient Near Eastern history at University College London, where she taught for the previous 10 years, from 2005 to 15. She earned her master's and her doctoral degrees from the University of Vienna and her habilitation from the University of Munich. Professor Radner is the author or editor of some 15 plus volumes, as well as scores of articles, most focused on the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the first half of the first millennium BC. I draw your attention to her 2015 book, Ancient Assyria, a very short introduction, a book that distills her deep and broad learning about political, military, social, and cultural matters, and introduces a general readership to the complexities of the Kingdom of Assyria. Among the honors and recognitions bestowed on Karen Radner are an award for pedagogical excellence from the University College London, and awards for her scholarly research numerous awards for her scholarly research and election to a number of learned societies, including the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the Academia Europaea, and the German Archaeological Institute. Her selection and appointment as Alexander von Humboldt Professor recognizes her with Germany's highest research prize as an internationally prominent scholar and leader in her field, and carries with it a 5-year award of more than 3.5 million euros. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was the powerful dominant state force in the Middle East in the early first millennium BC. From the 10th century on, its rulers and vast military machinery conquered all rivals, from Elam in Persia to the east across the Zagros Mountains, to Israel, Judah, and Phoenicia to the west on the Mediterranean coast, to Egypt in the southwest, and up in the north, the Hittites, Phrygians, and Urartians in the north from Anatolia through the Balkans. To rule the Assyrian state, covering this vast area of vassal states and conquered provinces, a multilingual, multi-ethnic, multicultural empire, demanded a complex and sophisticated military and administrative structure. In language alone, the empire's peoples probably spoke dozens of different languages and dialects, including Akkadian, Sumerian, Egyptian, Hittite, Hurrian, and especially Aramaic. During this period, it was Aramaic, a Semitic language written with fewer than 24 signs, a syllabo-alphabetic script, that came to be the common language across the empire. Indeed, many might argue it enabled the empire. By the middle of the first millennium BC, Aramaic supplanted and replaced Akkadian as the imperial language. The well-known image of a pair of war correspondents overlooking a battle, one writing with a stylus in Akkadian, cuneiform on a clay or wax tablet, one writing with pen and ink in Aramaic on parchment or papyrus, epitomizes both the social complexity of the Neo-Assyrian society and the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic acrobatics, indeed, necessary to manage such a vast enterprise. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had everything: imperial bureaucracies, military innovations, literary and cultural sophistication, exemplified by the famed Library of King Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, comprising more than 25,000 records representing every aspect of intellectual and administrative life. Yet in its last decades, just before 600 BC, it was marked by internal struggles for the throne, civil wars and coups, and uprisings of its previously defeated vassals, especially the Babylonians in southern Mesopotamia and the Medes in northwestern Iran. Indeed, within 50 years, the once mighty Assyrian Empire was itself in vassalage to the Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great. How, one should ask, was the Assyrian Empire so successful, and how did anyone dare to challenge it? Prepare to be enlightened by our speaker, Professor Karen Radner.
So thank you very much. First things first, I have to switch on the microphone. And then I have to adjust the microphone. So. And now you need to tell me whether it works. Does it work? Brilliant, okay. Thank you so much for having me. The reason why I have two microphones is because I am never able to stand behind the lectern for very long, and I will certainly wander over to my slides. It's as ever a great pleasure to be here in Chicago at the Oriental Institute. It's a great pleasure to meet so many friends and colleagues again. It's also a pleasure to meet friends and colleagues from Northwestern who are also here. And I'm very, very pleased and delighted to be able to talk about my favorite topic, the Assyrian Empire. I've spent my entire adult life dealing with the exciting period that Martha has summed up just now. And we are going to follow up some of the remarks that she made when we discuss now Assyrian imperial power on the one hand, and then ways how to oppose it. Let me start by focusing on Assyrian imperial power. This here is an impression of the Assyrian imperial seal. I could have chosen an example here in the Oriental Institute Museum, but I didn't because those that you have here from Dur-Sharrukin are burnt and therefore very, very dark. You can go into the gallery and see two very nice specimens. This one here is from Nineveh, and I think you can see very clearly what the seal impression depicts. It's on the one hand the Assyrian king, and on the other hand a lion, a male lion, who the king slays with his two knives. One knife goes into the head, the other one goes into the breast, into the throat. Who can tell? But the lion roars, he's rampant, as we would say, and this indicates that the king of Assyria is the guarantor of peace. He is the champion who defends not just the Assyrian people, but all humankind against chaos, because that is what the lion stands for. The lion is all evil. Yeah? To the Assyrians, this image conveyed what was instrumental to the royal Assyrian ideology, that the king is what stands between chaos and peace. Yeah? Okay, so Assyrian imperial power is a topic that we can study in great detail through a variety of different sources, and art is, of course, one of them. We need to focus at first on the size of the state. Martha has already described Assyrian power at its largest extent, I want to start in the 9th century BC when things are a bit more modest. And still, at that time, Assyria outclasses all surrounding states by a multiple. It is by far the largest territorial state in the region, and yet it has a very compact size and compact shape. In terms of size, I think one needs to really emphasize how small it really is. Yeah, because all this talk of stretches from the Mediterranean to Iran, from Anatolia down to the Gulf, creates the impression that it has a size that might almost rival that of Russia, of the US. It certainly doesn't. This incarnation of the Assyrian state encompasses the territories of the size of modern Greece. And Greece is many things, but it's not very large. Yeah? Good. So, in red here, I have marked the city of Kalchu, Nimrud nowadays, and it is the year 879 BC that marks the move of the Assyrian political power, if you will, from Assur to the south to this city of Kalchu. And to me, this move, which I'll discuss in some detail in a few minutes, to me, this move marks the beginning of the imperial period of the very, very long Assyrian history that precedes this moment in time. Assyria is a kingdom. When we talk about empire and so on, then this is completely modern terminology. To the ancient Assyrians, there was the kingdom of Assyria, and it had been in existence since the 14th century BC, Mat Ashur. We like to break down periods, of course, into smaller, more manageable units, and when I talk about the Assyrian imperial period, that starts for me in the year 879 BC. Others may have other ideas, but I hope to convince you that this is a monumental moment in the political development of that state. So before we go into that, here is Assyria at its largest extent. I should really remind myself and you that what I show here is the territories that are under direct control of the Assyrian king. Those are the regions within my black line. There are, of course, very, very many client states, Martha called them vassal states, that surround this black line and that are also beholden to the power of Assyria. But the black line marks the provincial extent of Assyria, and by the year 672 BC, when Assyria reaches its largest extent in terms of the provincial system, the country is the size of roughly modern Spain. Now, Spain is indeed one of the larger European countries, but again, it's certainly no match for Russia or Canada or the US. Yeah? So often the maps that we use are hugely misleading, and I want to just here show you a graph that shows the directly controlled territories linked to the various important time points. We start here with our first map, that was Ashurnasirpal, and we end here with our last map under Esarhaddon. And you can see that the territorial gain was very remarkable. And you can also see that most of this happened in the mid-8th century. Yeah? So if one is interested in Assyria, then there's, in the imperial period, then there are several specific moments in time that are very, very exciting to study. And one of them is when Tiglath-Pileser III expands the state drastically and almost triples its directly controlled territory. We are not going to focus very much on that. We are going to focus on the period under Ashurnasirpal first, and then very much on the period in the 7th century at the end of our graph. When we compare now these various incarnations of Assyria to the various European countries, then the red lines are always the growth of Assyria, and I just want you to know that Assyria at its very best is significantly smaller than France, is slightly bigger than Spain, and Germany is not so far off from the extent of Assyria during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser. Those of you that are interested in the early modern period and early modern European history will understand when I claim that what we can see in Assyrian history is often paralleled in what we can observe in the history of the early nation state in Europe, when France and Spain are consolidated. So that's, in a way, a much, much better comparative often than comparing Assyria with the Roman Empire or the Achaemenid Empire. And that's what I want to achieve with this graph, really, to give you a sense of scale, because it is true that Assyria at this moment in time is the largest state in the Middle East ever, but it is still manageable. It's not enormous. We are not dealing with the vast expenses that you can see here from Chicago. Nothing like that. Yeah? It is Spain, France, Germany, the UK that you have to bear in mind. And in the early modern period, the challenges of making such a region cohere are substantial, but not unsurmountable. And the same is, of course, true for the 9th to 7th century BC, because the technological conditions at that time were not so very different from the 16th or 17th century BC, AD. Yeah? So that's one thing that we have to bear in mind. We should never, ever underestimate the Assyrian bureaucracy, the Assyrian state as such, because there is a lot that can be done in a region that is as compact and as manageable as what we are dealing with here. Okay, so to me, as I said, the imperial turn is the move to the new capital in 879 BC, so that's how Assyria looks like at that time, surrounded by very many much, much smaller states that all by accept the Assyrian king as their overlord, if you will. The Assyrian king himself has an overlord too, and that is the god Ashur. The god Ashur is who is really the king, the lord of Assyria, and the king of Assyria, the monarch, rules by the god's mandate. And this is an image that shows one of many kings of Assyria. They all choose to be portrayed in this manner, with this very distinct hat, with this type of garment. And you can go, of course, into the Oriental Institute Museum and see a fragment of such a stele and see depictions of Assyrian kings just like that. In this image, the king chooses to be portrayed in prayer, because that's what this gesture indicates. Assyrians pray like this, yeah? And that's what the king does here. So in this image, he is shown as a worshipper in front of the gods, and the gods are present in the shape of these symbols up there. In various texts, hymns, and so on, the king emphasizes, various kings emphasize their relationship to the god Ashur. The god Ashur is king, and whoever is the ruler is the representative of Ashur, the creation of his hands, his creature, if you will. So we are dealing with a type of rule where the king is not divine, but he is divinely chosen, divinely appointed, divinely led. Yeah? And the first and foremost function of the king of Assyria is that of a religious figurehead, because the king of Assyria is the chief priest, if you will, the chief intermediary between the god Ashur and the people. And it is part of this role of being the intermediary that he protects the people from all evil. Yeah? And we have to bear in mind that it is only in the 14th century when the kingship of Assyria is invented by one person called Ashur-uballit, that the king of Assyria also takes on the role of a military commander. Traditionally, the role is religious in nature, and the role is that of a spiritual figurehead, an intermediary with the gods. And the kings of Assyria never ever forego this important function. But in the first millennium, and especially in this imperial period that we are interested in, they choose to foreground other aspects, and especially their function as a military leader. Yeah? Okay. But this idea that it is in truth the god who is the king and that the ruler is only his tool, his representative, his creation, is very, very prominent. Now let's have a look at the god Ashur. So I say Ashur, sometimes I say Assur, it's the same thing. Don't worry about it. I tend to say Ashur when I mean the god, and I tend to say Assur when I mean the city that you can see here, in order so that there's some kind of distinction. But to the Assyrians, they are the same. The name is the same, and they are the same. This is an aerial image of Assur, and the most prominent corner is this rocky outcrop here, high over the Tigris. The Tigris is in spring flood here, and this rocky outcrop rises some 20 meters over the river when it's not in flood. And on top of this outcrop sits the temple of the god Ashur. And this rocky outcrop is not only where the temple is located, the rocky outcrop is the god, because Assur, in his nature, is a mountain deity. And here's an early depiction of the god from the temple of Assur, where you can see this. Following the artistic conventions of early Mesopotamia, the god is shown as sort of growing out of the ground. Those of you that are familiar with Mesopotamian art will know that these fish scale type things are meant to be the rock of a mountain. This is how mountains are always shown. And you can see that the human figure that then grows out of this mountaintop has various plants growing from his body, and next to him are two female deities that hold small vessels in their hands, and water is streaming from these vessels. So these are deified springs, deified water sources, and that is a very nice summing up of the geography of our mountain outcrop here, of our situation there. There is water here, it's well protected, it is the nucleus of the city of Assur that you see spreading out here around the temple. What you see here is actually an Ottoman period fortress, constructed there, of course, because of the excellent views over the plain that this offers. So the god Ashur is this rock and is the city that grows out from this temple, and he is therefore very stationary. You cannot take Assur away from the mountain, which is a good thing, but it can also be a problematic thing, because the god is tied so much to this one place that there won't be a problem for anyone who deals with Anatolia. But from a southern Mesopotamian perspective, this is a very, very curious thing. And that's something that sets this god very much apart from other deities that are worshipped in the Middle East at that time, that have far, far less of a deep, deep rooting in one particular place. Okay, so let's here look at an artistic impression of the sacking of Assur in the late 7th century. Don't mind the flames, focus only on the fact that the Ashur temple dominates this corner here. including the ziggurat, the stepped tower here. The royal palace is right next to the temple complex, is much smaller, is overshadowed, especially by the stepped tower, and surrounded by various other temples. There is no wall that would separate the palace from the temples, or indeed the palace and the temples from the rest of town. Everything is very, very close to each other. So we can say that while the king of Assyria is in residence in the city of Assur, he is very close to the god Ashur, as he should be, but he's also very, very close to the people. Assur is a very small place, very small, smaller than the campus in which we presently are. So it's a bit claustrophobic, or alternatively, you can say, the king is not removed. He is one with the people that he guides, that he rules. Okay, that completely changes in 879 BC, when one king, Ashurnasirpal II, moves his residence, his palace, to a completely different city, the city of Kalchu. You have seen it on the map. He creates a city that is very, very different from Assur, much larger, so large that it includes the two settlement mounds here that were both independent cities, towns prior to this move. One is turned into a citadel surrounded by walls that is dedicated to the palace of the king, by far the biggest building on this citadel, and there is nine temples are built there as well, but no temple for the god Ashur. Yeah? The other citadel, slightly smaller, has only a palace, and it's the king's military arsenal. It's a fully functioning palace as well, but it's devoted to matters of warfare, yeah, and administration. Whereas this palace here is the stage for the king to meet with his subjects, with the Assyrians, with everyone who has to follow the command of the king of Assyria and also the god Ashur. So in this new city, you can also see this black line that surrounds the lower town, where the houses of the people of Kalchu are situated. In this new town, the king is out of reach of the people, but also, of course, very much out of reach of Assur, because Assur remains at his holy rock in the city of Assur, in his temple. Yeah. So the king is also really center stage, because the Northwest Palace, as we call this palace, is at that point in time the largest building anywhere. It is a huge stage for the king to meet in a framework that he decides on with whoever wishes to meet with him, with whoever seeks to meet with him. And this building is, of course, much larger than the various temples surrounding it. It is very, very well visible from the plain, from the lower town. The king is at the center of the realm in this new building, far away from the people, far away from god Ashur, but very visible and very prominent. And this is, to me, the beginning of a new period of Assyrian history, when the king is emancipated from god Assur, but in the texts, in the official inscriptions, nothing changes. The sentiment that the god is the overlord and that the king is his representative, his tool, is still very, very prominent. Yeah? And what I find amazing is that this very drastic change in Assyrian political ideology, something that really completely transforms traditions that we can trace for over 1,000 years at that point, that this is being accepted. Not just during the reign of Ashurnasirpal, but also during the reign of his successor, which is mired in trouble towards the end, and the people of Assyria accept this emancipation of the king, this leaving behind of the deity, this new form of kingship that puts the king at the center of everything. And if we think of other similar projects, I think everyone will see the resemblance to what Echnaton does in New Kingdom Egypt, then of course one has to wonder, why on earth did this succeed? Yeah? Why were they able to convince people that this was the right thing to do? So I think we have to appreciate the enormosity of what's going on here, the very, very drastic change that we have here in the conception of kingship. And to me, therefore, this is the beginning of something very new. And when we talk about the kingdom of Assyria and the Assyrian Empire, we have to be aware of the fact that there is Assyria, the kingdom, that is sort of always on the verge of turning into a nation state. Yeah? It's, the idea is that the new people are counted as Assyrians. So within this black line, there is the idea of turning everyone into Assyrians, not outside. And that is really where the empire is, of course. In these regions that accept the rule of this king, in these regions that accept that they too have to participate in this political project that we have here. Okay, so let's now look at the people that arguably carry this project, the elites. The king is one person, fine. We all know that there need to be people that support someone's claims to power. Yeah? We are in a period where the traditional understanding has been undermined, has been changed completely. And so who are the people that agreed to support this political experiment? Who agreed to the idea of making the king of Assyria the most powerful individual at the time, in his own right, with the backing of God Ashur, but outside of the shadow of God Ashur? And those are, on the one hand, the elites inside Assyria, in the provinces, inside our black line, and on the other hand, people that live in the client states, the external elites. And we'll very briefly look at them before we ask ourselves, how does one oppose the imperial power? So for the internal elites, so the people within our black line, the key message is power is achievable, but it comes at a price. Yeah? And we have to appreciate that the move away from the city of Assur meant that many, many more people could hope to influence the king, to have access to the king, to be close to the king. In the city of Assur, as I said, a bit claustrophobic situation, of course, the people that lived in Assur were overwhelmingly privileged in their access to the king. Those were ancient families that could trace their ancestry for as long as the king himself, for centuries, for a millennium perhaps. And they were, of course, a danger to royal authority. No more of that in the new setup in Kalchu, because the king appointed an official to hand-pick people from all over the realm and also from the client states that were fit to live in the new capital. And this means that there is a great acceptance at the time to what I would call social engineering. There's a great acceptance at the time to be willingly submitted to relocation. Yeah? That, on the one hand, gives us an idea of the power that the Assyrian state enjoyed, but it also gives us an idea of the acceptance of that power and the possibilities that people must have seen in conforming to the expectations. So here, this is my take on the fundamental difference between the population setup of the city of Assur and the city of Kalchu. I'm sure you sort of understand what I mean with this. This is meant to be ancient, entitled, aristocratic people of Assur that think that they are just as good as the king, okay? And these are the people that the new capital is meant to attract. Those are meant to be artists, craftsmen, creative people that will inform imperial art and the creation of new technologies and so on and so forth. And Martha, in her introduction, has already pointed out that the Assyrian Empire was extremely successful in, if not inventing, then refining and implementing new technologies. Yeah. So that's, to me, a good way of highlighting this. And some of you will be aware of the fact that I've taken this from my MOOC, my massive open online course on the Coursera platform. You can see the link there. It's called Organizing an Empire, the Assyrian Way, and I had a lovely lunchtime meeting today with some docents of the Oriental Institute who'd taken the MOOC. If you want to know exactly how I think the empire is run, then I encourage you to sign up for this free course. And there is a lot of Playmobil, and I know that there are some other fans here. Professor Paulus here. Okay, not of my MOOC, but of Playmobil. So, to clarify that. Okay, so my point is, this new situation in the imperial age allows more people, at least to entertain the hope that if they cooperate, if they confirm, they will have more clout in this state. Yeah, it mixes things up. It, of course, privileges the king beyond anything. But many, many people will have thought that if they make certain sacrifices, they will have a better life. Yeah? So that is, for me, one of the reasons why this move to Assur worked. Because the people of Assur were the ones that suffered most from this. But overwhelmingly, the people in the territories under Assyrian control stood to gain from this. If we look at that map again, so this is the later incarnation of the empire, this moving of the royal residence, the creation of a new capital, that happens again and yet again. And it is a very powerful and successful tool, apparently, to maintain and strengthen royal authority. And of course, here in Chicago, you are in the very fortunate position to be able to go over to the museum and admire sculptures and finds from the Oriental Institute's excavations in the 30s in Dur Sharokin in Khorsabad and get a sense of the craftsmanship, the massive work that went into the construction of these new capitals every time. And be aware of the fact that each city is bigger than the previous one. Be aware of the fact that each time new people are being selected, chosen to live there with the king. And each time the king uses the chance to distance himself from someone else, because the other cities, of course, remain in existence. Okay, so power comes at a price for the elites. We should bear in mind, of course, that the Assyrian Empire famously used deportation, uses the mass resettlement of people throughout its existence. It's nothing new in the imperial age. This is an ongoing process, and we have to be aware of the fact that this really affected very many people. I gave a credit seminar yesterday on this topic, and we will move on, therefore. The other type of elites that I want to focus on is what I want to call the imperial elites. So those are the people that really help the king to govern, to rule. And those are overwhelmingly eunuchs, castrated men that are presumably as boys given over to the palace. They enter the palace and they are trained and educated in the palace and serve the king and the empire and are cut apart from their own families. Their identity is completely reconfigured as imperial servants. So what happens in the 9th century is that an old tradition at court that is not at all specific or singular to Assyria, this old tradition of having eunuchs at court to serve the royal family, to ensure that the royal bloodline is not in any way contaminated, that this old institution of the eunuch that is very strongly associated with serving a particular ruler, those are courtiers par excellence. This very old institution is transformed, just as that the role of the king is being transformed, because the eunuchs are now sent away from the palace. For centuries, eunuchs have served the royal family, the king, inside the confines of a royal palace. Now these people are sent out into the provinces to serve, especially as the governors of the, by the 7th century, 70 odd provinces that make up the territory within my black line. These people replace, on the one hand, family members of the royal family that had this position before, and also local elites that held power locally before. And they are immediately recognizable in a world where every adult male wore a proud beard, like the gentleman that I'm facing right now, in a world where every adult, of course, had a beard, wouldn't think of shaving unless he was a priest and had priestly functions, in which case he would shave all over. But in a world where the norm was that an adult would wear a beard, the eunuchs, of course, stood out immediately without the need for special dress or anything, because they are beardless. They're not clean-shaven, they are beardless. Okay, there are many doctors here, I know, and if you have questions, ask them later. Okay, so the eunuchs are a great emblem of the state of Assyria. They are a great symbol of how the influence of the king spreads through the lands. You see someone like that, you know they have a link to the king. Okay, so that's the imperial elites. There are some people, of course, that are in power who are not eunuchs, but the majority have made this sacrifice, or their family have made this sacrifice, that they will never have a family of their own, that they will never have children. In a society where having children is equated with having a good life in the beyond, a good life after death. So this is a big thing, and the royal family guarantees that they will take care of the death rights for all their servants, for all their eunuchs. And of course, that means that the royal family replaces the birth family, the future family for these men entirely. Okay? So this is another very, very big change that really shapes the political situation in Assyria drastically. And while eunuchs are nothing new at all, the use that is being made of them from the 9th century onwards is very, very different and very innovative. The big question always is, who are the eunuchs? I cannot answer that precisely. I can only say that it was clearly seen as a perfectly acceptable way of living. There was no shame in being a eunuch. They were considered men, and they were people that were members of the royal household. So that had a lot of status, of course. And we can presumably assume that some of them, many of them, or a few of them, we don't know, but at least some of them were members of the Assyrian elites that we've been discussing, that families choose to give up some of their sons because they wanted influence for them, or perhaps they hoped that there was still a link to the family and would seek to have this sort of link with the palace then. But on the other hand, it is perfectly possible that we have to assume the Chinese model here, and that that every region was under the obligation of sending the most talented, the cleverest boys to the palace. We don't know the details. The Chinese scenario would make a lot of sense, of course, but we have no way of knowing whether that's how it worked in Assyria. No text informs us about this. Okay, so let's turn to the external elites, the people beyond our black line. Yeah? In the Assyrian royal inscriptions, the relationship between the provincial territories and the client states are often painted in a very dire light. A lot of emphasis is on conflicts, and we have to be aware of the fact that we can learn quite a bit from these royal inscriptions, because the client rulers, from the viewpoint of the Assyrian crown, represent the most stable form of government in these client states. The Assyrian monarchy supported other monarchies. They believed that the claims of the legitimate ruling house were best protected, that it was in their best interest to have stability there. And that means that while there are rewards for loyalty, there is an enormous willingness to forgive all sorts of transgressions. Yeah? Because very frequently rebellions in the client states do not end up at all with someone entirely new being put on the throne. No, the family keeps on going, and quite often it's the offending ruler who is allowed to continue. Yeah? So we have to stress that the Assyrian royal house is linked to many of these client kings, families, by family relationships. On the one hand, members of these client kings' families were raised as hostages in Assyria, and on the other hand, there was intermarriage. The Assyrian king had one queen. There was one official queen with a particular status and role within the kingdom, but the king was legally married to very many women. It was quite unusual in the Assyrian realm, because the rest of society was overwhelmingly monogamous. Yeah? So that was another hallmark of the distinct and very separate social status of the king. So the king was linked personally in many ways to these client kingdoms by marriage and by great familiarity. On the other hand, there are also strong incentives for the local elites otherwise to consider the move to the Assyrian heartland. They had very, very good career prospects within the Assyrian army, and there were other opportunities at court, for example, in the personal entourage of the king. And on the whole, these local elites also profited from the improved infrastructure within the state, especially when it comes to trading. So Gianni Lanfranchi, in an important article from 1997, was really the first to point out just how much the external elites had to gain from cooperating with the Assyrian royal house. And he called that consensus to empire, and I think that's a very, very good slogan. So we have to bear in mind that this political regime enjoyed a lot of support. Yeah? And now we will turn to the second part of my talk. After hopefully having convinced you that the Assyrian Empire was not just one king's megalomaniac personal enterprise, yeah, and everyone else hated the idea, after hopefully having convinced you that the only way this could work for the long period of time that it did was by integrating what we tend to call the elites. Now I want to look at how could one oppose this extremely effective form of government. Yeah? Okay, so the Assyrian Empire can be described as a lowland predatory state. Sounds very grim, but I think you all understand what it means. So the heartland, of course, and most of the territory indeed is in the lowlands of Mesopotamia. The mountains, the deserts are often the boundaries, the frontier zones of the kingdom, and the lowlands are the regions where the state can best extract from the people what it wants as a predator, and that is taxes and labor, conscription and taxation. Yeah? And that is indeed what every state wants. That is nothing new at all, and is widely accepted at the time. Yeah? By the 9th century, the inhabitants of Mesopotamia had been used to giving up taxes and work to the state authority, not just for centuries, but for millennia. Yeah? So that's nothing new. We'll talk about the tax burden a bit later. Okay, but so if you didn't want to give up your taxes or your workforce to the Assyrian state, could still live in its territory, you just had to get off the grid, and that is a real option that you have. Yeah? You can avoid the lowlands, you can avoid the cities, and you can especially avoid farming. Yeah? If you do that, you don't have to pay taxes, and you don't have to offer labor because taxation and conscription is linked to land ownership, and particularly the ownership of farmland. Okay, but that means that you must show a willingness to make your life in the mountains or in the desert. It seems to me that most people in Chicago don't have that willingness, because otherwise you wouldn't be living in a big city. And that appears to be also the case in Assyria. Overwhelmingly, people lived in fairly large cities, and overwhelmingly, people were farmers. Yeah? Okay, so therefore, what are your options then if you want to live in the comfortable lifestyle of a person living in the city, eating cereals, eating beef, and eating all the trappings of the Mesopotamian diet that had been developed for millennia at that point? Well, you can exploit tax loopholes. That too will probably be familiar here. And the tax loopholes were considerable. So you could grow cereals other than barley, wheat, and emmer, because those were the ones that were being taxed. Those were the ones that the Assyrian state thought you would grow. You could raise livestock other than cattle and sheep and goats also, and equids, which no one did privately anyway. Horses were very much a state thing. And you could avoid city gates and river crossings. If you did that, you also didn't have to pay taxes. So I've an archaeological project in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish autonomous region, and specifically in the province of Sulaymaniyah. We've been working there since 2015. We call the place now the Dinka Settlement Complex, because we don't know what it's called. And you can see here on the map, you can see Dinka, and that's where we work, near the city of Kalatzeh. It's very lovely. My team is still there at the moment. They are sending me pictures of green landscapes, blue skies. The weather is so much better than in Chicago that I wonder what we all are doing here. But in any case, we've been working there since 2015, and our goal is to explore the lifestyle of people quite far away from the heartland of Assyria, from the excellent farming regions that are typically explored when one deals with the first millennium BC. And we have a lot of work to do, because our Iron Age settlement, that at one point gets taken over by the Assyrian state, spreads over 60 hectares according to the surface pottery that has been collected by us and by our colleagues from the French survey team, headed by Jessica Giraud. And we also have a magnetometer survey that has already 18 hectares covered. That's the gray here in the image. And we've been excavating a lot. We've had 2 seasons each year, and we've exposed over 1,000 square meters. And all of this is exciting, of course, but one of the main reasons why we are doing this is because we have the opportunity in the Kurdish region of collecting and exporting for study the organic material. So that's bones and all sorts of plant remains. Don't know whether she's here, but Melissa Rosenzweig from Chicago is our paleobotanist, and Tina Greenfield is the paleozoologist. And these are preliminary data. Not all has been analyzed so far, but we can already show that there are instances of tax-free farming and livestock breeding in our settlement. There's a lot of pig. We don't yet have the data on birds because that's very small bones that needs another type of specialist to analyze, but we are confident that we will find chicken bones because they do appear at that time in other Assyrian sites. It is precisely during that time, the 9th to 7th century, that the chicken starts its victory march over the world and becomes a favorite on the dinner table, also in Assyria. And these birds are not taxed. They come from India via Iran into the Mesopotamian plain at that time. And while they are, I'm sure you all know that on early Greek vases, roosters are sort of giving like flowers to a person one admires. Yes, they are beautiful. They are, wonderful gifts, but in the end you eat them, okay? So, no one keeps a chicken around because they have such nice personalities. If I offend anyone, forgive me, but it's very clear that they are in the end, they are eaten. So we don't yet know how big poultry is in our neck of the woods, but we can be confident that there is chicken bones. When it comes to the plant remains, well, we have all the expected stuff, so barley, wheat, emmer, but also bitter vetch. Now, bitter vetch, if you Google it, you'll learn quickly that it's a natural appetite suppressant. That's why it's apparently quite popular nowadays. It's also an animal feed, but you can just eat it as well. Being an appetite suppressant might be an added bonus. I've never eaten it myself. It's called bitter vetch for a reason, yeah. But that's something that we have there, and you don't pay taxes on that. You do pay tax on fruit, such as grapes, but you don't pay tax on lentils and peas and other vegetables. Now, it would be very nice if we also unearthed some cucumber seeds. That would be wonderful, because the cucumber also roughly at that time is supposed to migrate from the east to the west, but so far we haven't had any. There's the hope, however, that it turns up. But it's, to me, it's important to just point out that there are very many ways how you can undermine the taxation system. If you are part of the Assyrian Empire, you can choose to become what one might term an internal periphery. There are all sorts of pastoralist groups within our Black Line that do not fully or not at all cooperate with the state authorities. And as long as they don't expect any special services, and especially as long as they are not obstructive, that seems to be fine. Yeah? So we have to be aware of the fact that by being inside the Black Line, inside the provincial system, you are not automatically a member of the Assyrian state. You have to opt into that, and you do that by choosing a particular lifestyle. Now, obviously, we have to stress that this particular lifestyle is the traditional lifestyle in that region ever since the Neolithic period. Yeah? So, but if you wanted to opt out, you could do it. And then you would oppose the Assyrian Empire. Okay, so given that conscription and taxation is all what is really what the empire wants, what the state wants, we have to stress that the concept of freedom does exist in Assyria. Zakutu is a thing. Freedom means to be exempt from taxes. That's what it means. It's a sense of freedom that many of you will be able to relate to. But I think it's worth pointing out that that is what freedom is in Assyria. And therefore, we will, in my final bit of the talk, will focus on tax exemptions. Okay, tax exemptions. Sounds like a great idea. Originally, within Assyria, they are a rare thing and are granted for land that supplies offerings, sacrifices for particular temples. It makes sense. Why would you tax this land when the proceeds go towards nourishing the gods in the temple? Ultimately, all taxation in Mesopotamia derives from the idea that you owe the gods their due. The original idea of the tax is a sacrifice to the gods. Yeah? And by that time, it is the state, the king, who has appropriated the idea, and we will see, however, that sacrifices and taxes are still very, very close. We'll look at a text in a moment. Okay, things take a different turn, apparently, late in the 8th century under the reign of Sargon II, who you are all familiar with because we are at the Oriental Institute and the Burj-Sharukin gallery is around the corner. So Sargon II is deeply unpopular, deeply, deeply contested as king at the beginning of his reign and several times after. And he exempts entire cities wholesale from tax. And those tend to be precisely the cities where he's most unpopular. Yeah? So I'd say he does that in order to boost his popularity. There seems to be a very clear link. Yeah? Okay. That is a good idea in the short term, but on the whole it creates various problems. We can see that from the state correspondence of Sargon's time. There is a letter from the governor of Ashur who is really, really upset with the king and writes, so, okay, you already have exempted the city of Assur from taxes, and now you've also exempted the city of Ekalatum. So how on earth do you think I'll meet my quota? Yeah? So that sums it up nicely in many ways. So, okay. With Sargon's death, it appears that all these tax exemptions are, of course, nil and void. That's the idea. If you want to be exempt from tax, you make sure that I stay on the throne. That's basically what he's doing. His immediate successors are not overly keen on the idea. They don't apparently need to. They are secure enough in their power. And then comes Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal has a lot of good press. It's inexplicable to me because he is a terrible king. He's on the throne for a very, very long time. And I would say the end of the Assyrian Empire that Martha summed up very neatly in the beginning, that is very much due to the fact that he is on the throne for such a long time. And God knows what happens towards the end of his reign, but he does all sorts of weird things. And one thing is also that when he finally dies, there's only a child to be his successor, which shouldn't really be an issue at all because he had children at the time when he was a crown prince already. So things are very, very weird towards the end of Ashurbanipal's reign. And Ashurbanipal has a lot of cronies. Ashurbanipal, as many of you will know, completely gives up on the idea that the king needs to be the military leader of the Assyrian Empire. He gives up on the idea of fighting all evil on the battlefield, and he instead is more of a ritualist, let's put it like that. Yeah? He supports his country in other ways, and he takes this role of a conduit between the god Ashur and between the people very, very seriously, no doubt, and that is, after all, the central role of being king of Assyria, but it doesn't translate in being a very active king that is among the people. So there is a clear indication of the king surrounding himself with cronies that are being rewarded extremely well for their loyalty. And most of these cronies, thank God, are eunuchs, because at least when they die, no one will inherit the massive, massive privileges of tax exemption that they have on all their land. Yeah? Okay, so Ashurbanipal does funny things like making the chief cook and the chief musician the eponym of the year, so the person that lends his name to the year. This is one of the indications that we have that he's very much closed up in the palace and doesn't really interact very much anymore with the traditional imperial elite, our eunuch governors that are everywhere else. So he's really among this closed group of people. And those are the ones that are exempted from taxes as a reward for their loyalty. In difficult times, no doubt, only we don't quite know what the difficult times really are. But it seems that the royal family is busy killing each other off at that time, because otherwise it's difficult to explain why his eventual successor, Ashur-etel-ilani, Ashur is the prince of all gods, is the meaning of his name, why he's a boy when he comes to the throne. A boy that needs the guidance of the chief eunuch, Sin-Shumu-Leshir, to do things. And he comes to the throne after a succession war, and in the aftermath of that succession war, he grants tax exemption to all the military commanders that were on his side. And the big change is now that these are not eunuchs, that they have children, and that the tax exemption is explicitly granted in perpetuity for all times for the person and their descendants, their heirs. Yeah? So that's a radical departure. So till the end of the 8th century, the Assyrian state was all about collecting taxes, but it was also growing. Now at the time when it was no longer growing in territory, when the provincial system didn't see any kind of gain anymore, they come up with the tax exemption. Makes sense, but I would argue it's a bad idea. Okay, so here is one such text. It's a tax exemption for the cohort commander Tabsha Papahi, some very ordinary guy. One of very many military commanders is what I mean by that. Unlike the people that are exempted from tax during the reign of Ashurbanipal, who are much more elevated. We have a chance to very briefly look at the tax burden in Assyria, because it's really not all that much, comparatively speaking. So the text and its the various other tax exemptions from the reign of Ashur-etel-ilani have this list of taxes that don't need to be paid. I'll read it out to you. The corn taxes of these fields and orchards shall not be collected. We know that the tax duty would be 10% on those. The straw taxes shall not be gathered. That's an Assyrian Imperial innovation, that one collects tax on straw, and it's the highest tax of all, 25%. Okay. These people shall not be called up for labor and corvée service or for the levy of the land. So that would amount to the labor, the conscription. We've talked about that's 100 days per year. They are free from quay, crossing, and gate dues on land or water. They are free, we restore, from the sacrifices in all the temples. So here we have the sacrifices again, as I promised you that there's a link still between sacrifices and taxes. They are free from boat and crossbar. Don't know what that means, no one really does. It seems to be another kind of crossing or entry fee. No tax on his cattle, sheep, and goats shall be collected. And finally, he shall not turn over anything of his earnings at the conclusion of a business venture. That sounds pretty nice, I'm sure, to all of you. So that's the extent of the Assyrian tax duty. We don't always know how much it is, but it is very little compared to modern standards, of course. Yeah? So it's not an overwhelmingly big burden. There are various Achaemenid specialists here, and they will all be able to tell you that the tax dues in Achaemenid times were much, much higher. Yeah? But no one rebelled against the Assyrian Empire because of the tax duty. No, that was really not a problem. We have said that the Assyrian Empire is a lowland predatory state. That sounds very disagreeable. But we can also say the Assyrian Empire is a community of taxpayers. Then it sounds still a bit odd, but more pleasant perhaps. I think it's a very good description of the Assyrian Empire, especially as it doesn't preclude the existence of our internal peripheries of people in the mountains, people in the desert, people that grow bitter veg and so on, people that eat chicken. So the Assyrian Empire, if we describe it as a community of taxpayers, those are the people that accept the king as their sovereign, and they pay their taxes. And that's a good recipe for stability, and it seems to work. So therefore, it's a really, 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 really bad idea to start granting tax exemptions, because that corrodes the sense of community and solidarity that people apparently felt for a long time for this state. And I end with that. Thank you very much. Yeah.
And we do have time for a few questions.
Okay, so you take questions and I'll let you call on people.
Yeah, sure.
There's some microphones that will go around, so please wait after you're called on.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Basil. I'm a graduate student in the Social Sciences Division.
Hi.
I'm curious to know, do we know anything about the political economy at the time that made the Assyrian Empire only choose those specific goods and services to tax, and that also made people not substitute away from them? Like, why did people still grow this stuff?
Yeah, good point. So the short answer is those are the traditional cereals and livestock breeds that are being used in the region. And my point is that, yes, they do opt out. Yeah? But you won't see that from the texts, because the texts all have a link to the central administration. And the central administration is only interested in the stuff that they tax. So that's why it's important to do field work, and that's why it's important to spend enormous amounts of time and money on working on paleobotany and paleozoology, because that will give us the rest of the picture. I would argue that yes, you can opt out, and yes, people did opt out. Yeah? Yeah? David?
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I'm wondering, what do we know, or what do you think about why some client kingdoms were provincialized or incorporated and others were not? So, for example, Samal in the north was, and Judah in the south was not.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the short answer is, when it made economic and political sense to do it, they did it if there were trouble for a sustained period of time. So the big question is, why does Tiglath-Pileser III start expanding the provincial territory as massively as he does? And of course, he comes to power at the lowest point of the kingdom's history, when the kingdom of Urartu to the north of Assyria had humiliated the Assyrian Empire on the battlefield 10 years earlier, and when Tiglath-Pileser's predecessor didn't do anything. Yeah? So he comes to the throne as a usurper, and he seems to have been a hawk. Yeah? He certainly came from the military, and it seems that this the initial conquest is right there where the humiliation on the battlefield had taken place. These are the client states that, after supporting Assyria for a very long time, had thrown in their fate with the northern rival Urartu. That had been accepted for 10 years. It seems to have been 10 very long years for some people in Assyria. And Tiglath-Pileser is able to come to the throne as a military leader, and then this carries him basically through his entire life. He never stops conquering. And then he dies apparently of old age. His son, who had been the crown prince, Shalmaneser V, succeeds him, carries on, goes beyond these borders. Then there is a succession war. Sargon II comes to the throne, and it stops. Yeah? So I would argue that this war machine of Tiglath-Pileser was something that made the internal elites very happy for a time, because, of course, it meant great, great riches for those who participated in this war. Yeah? And then something happens, and we really don't quite know what the reason is that Sargon comes to the throne, but I've already said that he was deeply unpopular in various places, but at the same time it's very clear that he stops with the expansion. Yeah? So I think on the one hand there is this, so we always have to take into account who is in power in Assyria at a particular time, and then what are the local circumstances. There are certain things that make Judah quite difficult to control, as we all know. It's basically mountains and deserts. Yeah, we've already said that that's sort of quite unattractive. The Kingdom of Israel is another matter. That's perfect real estate, really. So yeah, that can be really easily integrated into this system. So I think for each individual region, we have to really look at the political context in Assyria and the ecological and economical context in the particular region. And most of the time, the decisions can be explained somehow, I'd say. Please.
Do we know what kind of system they had to collect the taxes?
Yeah, good question. A very decentralized one. Compared to the later periods where tax farming was a thing, where you could sort of buy the right to collect taxes, there's nothing like that in Assyria. This is one of the main duties of the provincial governors, but it was the duty of the taxpayer to produce the material. Yeah? So sometimes the government apparently comes sort of halfway and meets the people, so to say, but we have a lot of obligation documents, we call them, debt notes, that stipulate that a certain amount of grain very often has to be delivered somewhere within a specific time. And so this is all part of this tax paying. It's the foremost duty of the provincial governors, and the provinces are all very small by and by. Yeah? So it's doable again. And then most of it is really spent right there. So we mustn't imagine that huge amounts of tax payments, which would usually be in kind. So you have animals and you have food stuff, that would then be shipped to central Assyria. The country was chopped up into these very, very many provinces, and the provinces were all meant to be largely self-sufficient. And yes, you have the palaces, but we have to always bear in mind that there are many palaces, not just the one, and they provide then regional centers of tax collection. When we have texts that describe the creation of a palace, then it's always emphasized that they serve as storage units. Yeah? So, but that's not only true for Dur-Sharrukin and Kalkar and so on and so forth, but there are many, many such regional palaces. Yeah? So it's very decentralized.
And we have time for one final question.
Yeah, the gentleman there. It's a bit of a, I'm very sad that I only get questions from men. Yeah? So I have to point it out. Ladies, but please. Okay, so I insist, Matt, that you must allow a second question. Okay, so
Professor Radner,
please, but
just curious, how extensive was the use of Aramaic across the empire, and how long did that last?
how extensive was the use of their what?
Aramaic.
Aramaic, yeah. Very extensive. From the 9th century onwards, we know that the central administration runs a system in duplicate, and this is cuneiform and Assyrian and Aramaic in alphabetic script. So that is the way the central administration runs things everywhere. And therefore, I would say the use is extremely extensive, and Aramaic is one of the 2 official languages of the Assyrian administration.
And how was that communicated? How were these commands communicated? The exemptions and all that sort of stuff?
They obviously, the sources we deal with are clay tablets. And the thing about Aramaic is that it's not typically recorded on clay tablets. So I wouldn't exclude that there are tax exemptions in Aramaic. I wouldn't. But what we have is all in cuneiform and in Assyrian. And now I get a question from Peter here. Professor Goedegeboeren. Yes. Yes.
Yes, so if kings in succession start, of course, exempting people from paying taxes, and these are sometimes, it seems to be substantial numbers of people, where does the money come from?
Instead,
Otherwise,
yeah. Good question. That's the question the governor of Assur asks of Sargon, and the king basically says, "Well, not my problem." Yeah, and that's why I think these tax exemptions have a very corroding effect on the state as a whole.
Because I could imagine that you either let it go, but then you don't get any income anymore, or you start basically oppressing.
But as I said, these provinces were largely self-sufficient. So if the king exempts 2 cities in your province, you really had a big problem. We have to bear in mind that most of the exempt cities during the reign of Sargon are in Babylonia, and that Sargon has a new idea of how to organize the south, and he comes up with what proves to be quite unsuccessful, but he basically wants to have 2 super provinces. One is called Babylon and the other one is Gambulu, and then it wouldn't matter all that much if he sort of exempts almost all major settlements from taxation, because the overall region would be so large. But this is very short-lived, because none of his successors ever make this Gambulu Babylon province division their goal. So it's very short-lived, but I see very much a link between the tax exemptions and this administrative reform that he tries to push through.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I also had a number of questions, but I'm not going to ask them now.
What have I done? I created a monster.
Would you all please join me in thanking Professor Karen Radner for... And please join us for a reception in the galleries, where I'm sure Professor Radner would be happy to answer more of your questions, particularly about how to resist taxes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you.